That's not stapled, so take those.
Okay.
Thank you. Very nice, Douglas. Nice to see
problem.
you. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Andy, you're going to have to hear the Esther story one more time. So we'll do it a little differently. We'll do it a little differently than we did it last time. No, it's not. No, actually, much worse. It's the R-rated version is much better. So. Sorry? How was what? Mort? He's fine, yeah. As far as I know. He's been in Minyan. He comes to Minyan in the morning. Yeah, he was there Thursday. He was in Minyan. Mort, hello. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Boker Tov, Shabbos. Yeah. Okay. Good morning, Howard. You okay? Good, good. Okay, good. 2. All right, good morning. Good to see everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I hope everybody is well. This morning, following our learning, you're invited to pray with us. My friend Harrison is having his bar mitzvah, sweet boy. And following that, there's lunch. And following that, there's Parsha study in the lounge, in the youth lounge. This coming week, tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock, Cantor Barron is putting on another one of his series on Jewish music. And tomorrow afternoon's concert is called Esther's Daughters. It's 5 major female composers and performers from here and beyond that he's gathered together. It's a lovely concert. So it's tomorrow afternoon, 4 o'clock here at the Shul. Cost a few dollars, and then there's cookies. Everything we hear has cookies. And then Monday, of course, is Purim. Monday night is Purim. We'll talk about that in just a moment. There's 3 Megillah readings here in the building. At 5:30 for small children, it's called Tat Megillah. It'll be in the Sher Lapati. Little kids are invited to come. We did away with groggers, and we did something nice. So we're asking everybody to bring a box of macaroni. And you'll use a box of macaroni as your grogger, and then you'll donate it to the food bank. And for any kids who can't find macaroni in the supermarket, we have like tons. We bought like a pallet of it. So, but the nice thing is that the kids know that the grogger does something nice after Purim.
I have a Grogger app.
You have a grogger app. Only in America. Digital Judaism. And then at 6 o'clock, the Minyan will be meeting here. And the Minyan has a traditional reading of the entire Megillah with groggers. And then at 7 o'clock in the new gym, in the Levine's Community Center, Cantor Barron and the boys are putting on, it's called Phil and Ed's Excellent Adventure, a time travel spectacular starring God knows who. It's amazing. So come and enjoy. The whole spectacle. It's a lot of fun, actually. Very sweet. That's going to be on Monday night. Tuesday morning, if you come to Minyan, they'll do the Megillah all over again. Next Sunday, not this Sunday, but next Sunday, we're having our version of the Purim Carnival. It's also sort of changed to the 21st century. It's Purim Palooza. And every room of the building will have a different, it's a great activity. So that they told me no goldfish, so what can I tell you? So come and, we didn't want to get picketed by PETA, so people for the ethical treatment of goldfish. So anyway, so come on, bring little kids next Sunday for the carnival. But it's a lovely celebration of Purim. That's what's going on the whole week. And then there's other things going on later in the month. We have an evening with our friend Jody Myers, who's a professor at CSUN, has published a new book on Jewish food. And why read when you can eat? So we're going to have a night. Jody will present her book. And the young man, Ari, who owns, there's a bakery called Lodge Bread. They have an outlet in Pico Robertson. They just opened one in Woodland Hills. And he also has a hummus restaurant now on Pico. And I ate there the other day. It's fabulous hummus. And Lodge Bread, it's a wonderful bakery. Terrific challah. So he's coming and he's going to bring a sample of everything he makes. I think so, yeah. I don't think it's LODZ. That's what I thought. Lodge, you know.
Is it kosher?
Yeah, it's kosher. Yeah, yeah. So come and enjoy that. I think it's Lodge. I think it's LODG. I've had challah from there. It's out of this world. It's just wonderful challah. I think it's kosher, yeah. Is it better than sunflower? You're asking me. For my considered professional opinion, yes, it is. But don't. I'm sorry. I mean, I think it's a very good challah. Everybody has their own look. Trader Joe's is good, you know. My dad's very good, you know. Well, I have my own taste. I mean, what can I tell you? What can I tell you? Yeah. It's on the 25th. It's the fourth week in March. Yeah. Sorry? You know, I did, but it slipped my mind. I'll remember in a minute. It's very good. It was very good. Okay. Many cultures have a festival this time of year as the winter time gives way to spring. So there is a festival celebrated in many cultures around the world. It's called Carnival in Europe and in Brazil. It's Mardi Gras in New Orleans, right? There's a similar one in China. Anthropologically, it's when the death of winter gives way to the rebirth of springtime. When the darkness of winter gives birth to the light of the spring. Oh, by the way, tonight, there's the halacha tonight is that you turn your clocks ahead. Tonight's the night. No, it's true, because you think we rabbis have weird customs, you know, and you can't eat lobster and stuff like that. I mean, who ever thought of an idiot thing like this? Turn your clock this way, turn your clock that way, gewalt. But tonight, 2 o'clock in the morning, make sure you turn your clock or you're going to be late for your appointments tomorrow. But it's part of this idea that the light of the spring is overcoming the darkness of winter. The light of the springtime life of springtime is overcoming the death of the winter. The death spirits are being chased away. And so many of these cultures, for example, involve masks. Because you're taking, the mask is the way to scare away the death spirits and welcome the life of the springtime. In Venice, there's a whole industry of making these beautiful, beautiful masks. In Brazil, costumes and masks are very popular. It's usually, because in the Catholic tradition, it's followed by Lent, which is a time of fasting and withdrawal from bodily pleasures. Carnival, as the name carne would involve, is a feast. It's the last meat you can eat before Lent comes in. So you're supposed to indulge. You indulge in drink, you indulge in meat, you indulge in food. And it's also a time when everything is sort of turned upside down. I mean, so the tightness of holding on for the winter gives way to the looseness and sensuality of springtime. So there's a sort of feast of fools is the tradition where the wise people are deposed for the day and the fools are elevated. Everything is turned upside down. Our version of this holiday is called Purim. And Purim is, of course, Monday night. Purim is this very strange Jewish holiday when all of the canons of decorum, all of the notes of discipline of the tradition are turned upside down, right? So we feast and you're going to read a biblical book in the synagogue and make lots of noise. This is the opposite of the way you'd normally behave in shul. You spend the rest of the year trying to get to the truth about the soul and the self, but on this night we're going to wear costumes and pretend we're somebody else. You're going to feast to excess. There is a tradition of inebriation, of drinking an awful lot. And so rabbis of the Talmud, of course, are very quantitative. They're lawyers, and they want to know, okay, how drunk do I have to get? And so the tradition is ad lo yada, until you can't tell the difference between Mordechai and Haman, which I can testify is an awful lot of alcohol. Ad lo yada, because everything is flipped, everything is upside down, everything is turned inside out, everything is not what it appears to be. The joke is that one time of the year we have Yom Purim, Chag Purim, and the other time we have Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippur, or Yom Kippurim. And the difference is that on Purim, wise people pretend to be fools, and on Yom Kippur, fools pretend to be wise people, right? That's the difference, you see. So on Yom Kippur, it's like the opposite of Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, you try to unmask the self, and on Purim, you remask the self. And it's this goofy, sort of strange holiday when all of the discipline is let go, and we have this strange, funny holiday. And there's a book at the heart of it. Everything Jewish has to have literature, right? And the book at the heart of it is a Megillah, is a short book that occurs at the end of the Hebrew Bible that's read in the form of a scroll. So that's where Megillah comes from. It's what the word Megillah means. And it's called Megillat Esther. It's a book of 10 chapters. This is an abridgment. This is, I took about 40% of the book out just to make it readable for us. And I'll tell you what I took out, so you'll know I didn't take out the important stuff. And it's a very strange book. It's a very weird book. And it's one of these books of the Bible. There's a famous scholar named Elias Bickerman who once wrote a book called 4 Strange Books of the Bible. And this is one of them. Because you read the book and you'll say, huh? Like, this is in the Bible? It's in some ways, and I want you to read this with me because I want to hear your interpretation. Because every time I read this book, and it's me, I know it's me, I get more cynical. Every time I read this book, I read it in a more cynical way. So Rabbi House is here, so he's going to help me. Rabbi Gelman is out in the world, so we needed someone to bring the faith to the tradition. So thank you, Ronnie, for being here, and it's my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi House. So yeah, Billy.
Hello.
Yeah.
Book of Esther is the only book not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, the Book of Esther, there's a bunch of things like that. So number one, the Book of Esther is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So why the Qumran community didn't save it is a really interesting question. And then, of course, there's some wag who wrote a critique of that paper. There's a paper that's written about this. And he said, no, it's the opposite. Because they read it so much, they wore it out and didn't save it. Only the books you don't read survive 2,000 years of history. That's brilliant.
And I still have my
I was
college
teaching
textbook.
this the other day. I taught this to the Hebrew school teachers. I said, and there's a couple of people in that group who are really wonderful. I mean, they're all wonderful people, but it's a couple of more religious women. And I said to them, I think this is an atheist book. And the woman looked at me like I was out of my mind and said, are you kidding? God is on every page. Now, the name of God appears nowhere in the book. And you'll see in a moment that there are these critical turning points when you would have expected the characters to turn toward God, which is what would have happened if it were Torah. But they don't. They turn elsewhere. And I said, this is a book where God is absent. And this woman looked at me like I was out of my mind. So, no, God's everywhere in this book. Otherwise, none of this would have happened. And which is such an interesting, the joke, of course, is, the Torah in Breshit is Vayetze Yaakov mir Beersheva. Jacob left and went to Beersheva, and left Beersheva and went to Haran. And the great question of the rabbis is, how do you know that it's obligatory to wear a sweater according to the Torah's halacha? And the answer is, do you think his mother let him leave the house without a sweater? Here you have a book where God's name occurs no place, and here is a wonderfully religious soul who says, no, it's everywhere. Hi.
May I have one of those?
Yes, right here.
Oh.
Yeah. We accommodate everybody in this minyan. Wait, take one that has all the pages. There you go. So anyway, so here we go. The other thing that's missing from the book is any mention of Eretz Yisrael. Again, any place where you'd think that they would look back toward Israel, where they would be aware of exile and long for a return home, you don't find that here either. So this is the quintessential diaspora book, or if you want to go deeper metaphysically, this is the book of exile, where we are separated from God. And you'll tell me whether I'm too cynical, and I'm perfectly willing to accept that because these days I'm very cynical. Yes, please.
When do biblical scholars think this was written?
The general consensus is that it was created during the Persian exile and then written down during the early Hellenistic period. As you'll see, it bears the motif, and I'll ask you this a little bit later, it bears motifs of a certain genre of literature called Persian court dramas. Persian court dramas, Scheherazade, 1001 Arabian Nights, Aladdin, Sinbad the Sailor. These kinds of imaginative stories told about the Persian court from outside the Persian court. I mean, I'll give you the best analogy, and forgive me for this. You remember those 1950s movies like Sinbad the Sailor that looked back at the East, the exotic East, and they were colored in all these pinks and pastels? And the same guys who did those movies, of course, are the guys who built Wilshire Boulevard Temple. No, I'm not kidding. Wilshire Boulevard Temple was built by the Warner Brothers, design studio. And if you look at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, it's a Californian idea of what a Middle Eastern synagogue ought to look like. It's this kind of, weird, it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. And I love it. And when they remodeled it, it's even more gorgeous. But it's like, it's not really Middle Eastern. It's faux Middle Eastern. It's what people on this side of the ocean think that side of the ocean looks like. So it's based on a kind of literature that romanticized the Persian court. So it's written from the literature of the Persian court, but afterwards, when it became a popular mythological sort of motif. And that's when most people think. And then the question is who let it into the Bible? Right? And that's going to be a question. We've asked that question about Kohelet and Job and the Song of Songs, which are all books that you say, huh? But the idea there is that you have to turn the question upside down. The reason you ask the question is that you kind of assume that the Bible has a theme, a through line, a sort of theological point of view. It doesn't. It doesn't. It's a much broader variety of reflections of the human condition than we give it credit for. So the Bible has to have a book of sensuous eroticism because that's part of the human repertoire. So that's Shir HaShirim. And the Bible has to have a book of bitter cynicism because that's part of the human repertoire. That's Job. And the Bible has to have a book of sort of wistful reflection because that's part of our repertoire. That's Kohelet. And the Bible has to have a book of ribald, hysterical craziness and politics. If you think Washington's weird, wait till we get to Shushan. Yeah.
So 1,000 years from now,
Yeah.
people are going to read all this stuff about Holocaust, about Eretz Israel independence,
Yeah.
and they may call it mythology. Are we doing the same thing to what happened?
That's a very beautiful question, Farzan. They're not going to call it mythology in the sense that it didn't happen. We have canons of historical accuracy and empiricism that our ancestors didn't have. We do. We collect facts. We verify facts in a way that our ancestors just didn't need to. They weren't interested in it. So they're not going to call it mythology in the sense that it didn't happen. It was a made-up story. I don't know if there was a Mordechai or an Esther.
Why don't we take this as a factual?
Because the people who wrote this were not concerned with factuality the way that we might be when we tell the story of our own history. They were not concerned with that. What they were concerned with, and here's where your question is very, very profound, is that whether it's fact or not, the way we tell a story, even with facts, we choose facts to tell and we ignore facts that are just we consider trivial. But what we do is we draw lessons from stories. It's mythology with a capital M, meaning it is a story that gives us a sense of, hi Gloria, welcome back. Lovely to see you. It's a story that gives us meaning. We draw meaning from stories. We draw lessons from stories. We draw truth, moral truth from stories. Okay? So the question's going to be 1,000 years from now, and it's not just 1,000 years from now. It's going to be in the next 10 years. I'll give you a prediction. In the next 10 years, the last survivor of the Holocaust is going to die, which means the last eyewitness of Auschwitz is going to leave us. Because figure a moment, right? If anybody was 10 years old in 1945, how old are they today? Not 65. 85, 95, right. I mean, so in 10 years, they're all going to be gone, right? When Holocaust ceases to be memory and starts to be history, the question we're going to ask is, what did we learn from this? Even to say, what happened? What happened? For example, you could say, even now we have these debates, but when the last survivor is gone, we'll have them in earnest. Was it a small group of madmen hijacked a great European country and turned it into an anti-Semitic hell? Or was it all of Christian Europe conspired to destroy its Jews? Or was it all the goyim of the world came after us? Or was it, you see, the question is, what story will we tell, given the facts in front of us, and what lessons will we draw? And that's a very profound question of how you read history. And the question, and whether we have facts or not, the question is going to be 1,000 years from now, what story will we have gathered? I'll give you a good example. In a month, we're going to have Pesach. Oh, by the way, start shopping now, before the price of brisket goes up. I don't know if you've been watching this in the newspaper, but as the stock market goes down, the price of kosher chicken goes up. It's the craziest thing. My wife went to the butcher, and chicken's 70 cents more expensive. And she said, what? You know, Pesach, that's what. Jews get out of Egypt, chickens become more valuable. Pesach, right? The rabbis of the Mishnah sat down in the first century to create our Seder. And the question they wanted to ask was, what are we going to say? Isn't it interesting that so little of the Seder is about slavery, and almost all of the Seder is about liberation? There are 5 things on your Seder plate, only one is bitter. The whole story is about liberation. But we were slaves for 270 years, and only one generation experienced liberation. But that's the story. We chose to tell the story as a story of liberation, not a story of subjugation. You could have told it the other way around. You could have had 5 bitter things on your Seder plate. You could have told it as a sad, angry, bitter story about how bad they were to us. But instead, we told the story of liberation. Right? When Rabbi Schulweis taught the story of the Holocaust, he chose to tell the story of Christian rescuers instead of Nazi monsters. And he had reasons for telling it that way. And people screamed at him. But he had reasons, because the way you tell the story, what you choose to tell, determines who you are. So the question is going to be, what story are we going to tell? What story are we going to tell? I mean, that's why it's such a wonderful question. Come back in 1,000 years and we'll figure it out, okay? Yeah, hi, David.
Yes, actually, the story of Holocaust, we have so much written, so much evidence, so much things that are present, that in 1,000 years, the precise happening of the 70 years ago will be very, very clear. Now, 2,500 years ago, this is a historical event that it did, in some form, did happen. There was a city, there was a king by that name. There is evidence that there were these 2 individuals, Mordechai and Esther.
Yeah.
We do have their graves in a city very close to the Shoshan. These are all there.
Okay. All right,
now,
look.
Whether it did happen as a drama, as it is written here, that I can agree. History, different people write it, different opinion, and so forth and so on, enter into it. But the fact is staying the same.
All right. I mean,
there was a historical
yes. You could make the case. You could make a case. Let's just leave it at that. All right. Let's enjoy it. Ready? You ready? You got to get in the mood. Okay. It happened in the days of King Achashverosh. Gesundheit. Achashverosh is typically translated as Artaxerxes. It's the name of a Persian king, as the Persian word was heard by people who don't speak Persian. Okay? That's why the name is a funny name. And the fact that it sounds like a sneeze is on purpose, right? King Achashverosh, who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Nubia. Nubia is Ethiopia. So from India to Ethiopia, the whole known world. The guy rules 127 provinces, okay? He occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan. So there's a place called Shushan, and there's a royal fortress there. But the better reason, the funnier thing is that if you write out the name Shushan in Hebrew, it's Sin Sin Vav Nun, Shushan, which spells the word Sason. Sason means happiness. It's the synonym for simcha. So where did he live? In the happiest place on earth. And you'll see this in a moment. This is part of the deal. In the fortress of Shushan, you're not allowed to bring bad news. Nobody gets the New York Times in Shushan. They only play good news in Shushan. You have to be smiling in Shushan. They don't let anyone with bad news or a frown on his face. No, no, no. Right? So, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for his officials and courtiers, administration of Persia and Media, the nobles and governors of the provinces, for no fewer than 180 days. He displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and splendid glory of his majesty. 6 months World's Fair. All the stuff I've stolen from the 127 provinces I now rule. It's like the British Museum. Have you ever been to the British Museum? Over the door, it has that wonderful saying in Latin, we came, we conquered, we ripped this stuff off. You know, we have the friezes from the Acropolis, from the Parthenon. We have the mummies from Egypt. We have the gates of Babylon. Wherever we were, we took it home with us. 127, 6 months we have a World's Fair. And then at the end of the period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for everyone who lived in the town, in Shushan, high and low alike. Royal wine was served in abundance, as befits a king, in golden beakers, beakers of varied designs. And the rule for drinking was no restrictions. It's like when I went to college. It's great. So what do we start out with? A drunken feast. A drunken feast. And this is going to be the setting of the book. It's the palace, and everyone is always lubricated. It's a drunken feast. And what you're going to see now is the following. The Torah presents us with a world governed by a God of morality. Genesis, Exodus is a God of justice. What is it like to live in a world with a God of justice is the question that the Torah asks. But here in Shushan, there is no God of justice. Here, the guy who rules the kingdom is drunk. What is it like to live in a world where the people in charge are drunk all the time? That's the question. It's a world of chaos. It's a world of loony. Look at what happens next. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered the 7 eunuchs in attendance on the king to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing a royal crown, to display her beauty to the people and officials, for she was a beautiful woman. He's shown off all the stuff that he owns. Now he wants to show off his prized possession, his wife. She's one of the things he's proudest of that he owns. Right now, of course, the Midrash is when he said, come down wearing your crown, he meant only your crown. Right. But Queen Vashti refused because she has an ounce of dignity, because she has one tiny gram of self-respect. She refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. The king consulted the sages learned in procedure. This is one of the themes of the book, by the way, and it's one of the themes of Persian court dramas, that everything has to be done in consultation with lawyers. And over again, you'll see, like, the lawyers keep getting brought in. They're like the chorus in this story. So the queen has now publicly disrespected the king. And it's obvious what you got to do with, but first you got to check with the lawyers. So, for it was royal practice to turn to all who were versed in law and precedent. What, he asked, shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus? And the obvious answer is, off with her head. Except up steps Memucan. Memucan is one of the 7 eunuchs. They play an important role in the story. They're the only men in the story, right? The only men, the only one with cojones in the story are the eunuchs, right? Everyone else stands there passively watching the drama. It's the eunuchs who have the cojones to step up and say, here's what should happen, right? They're the only rational ones in the story. Now, Memucan, as you'll see in a moment, is very sly in playing the political game and the game of male, masculine ego politics. Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but against all officials and against all men in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they know that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti be brought before him, and she would not come. This very day, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to your majesty's officials, and there'll be no end of scorn and provocation. Ladies and gentlemen, uppity women. Now you're saying to yourself, the guy rules 127 countries. He has conquered 127 countries. His armies conquer continents, and he can't get his own wife to come to dinner when he calls her? What? And this is what the Bible's worried about? This is a biblical book? Like, what the hell is going on? What? I mean, and this is what we're talking about? And Memucan, let's back to Memucan, right? What should we do with her? If it please your majesty, let an royal edict be issued by you. Let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, so it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never again enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let your royal majesty bestow royal state upon another who's more worthy than she. Then will judgment executed by your majesty resound through the realm, vast though it is, and all wives will submit to their husbands, high and low alike. The proposal was approved. Dispatches were sent. Every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. What's the punishment? That woman should never be allowed in your bed again. She should never sleep. She must never have the joy of sleeping with you ever again, ever. Now, what man would not think that's the worst exile a woman could suffer? What man isn't going to shake his head and say, yeah, that'll teach her. No more of my powerful masculinity. No more of passionate Ahasuerus love, right? No more. That's right. You send her away and she doesn't get to share the royal bedroom ever again. What has Memucan just done?
Saved her life.
Saved her life by doing what? By appealing to his rather small conscience, but rather large masculine ego, right?
Sure this isn't happening in the 20th century?
Now, come on, now stop that, Douglas. Stop that. I'm just reading the book from the Bible. Now you're reading this and you're saying, what? This is in the Bible. This is like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, Exodus, Leviticus. What? This is what we're talking about. Do children ever read this? This is a good thing it's in Hebrew. No one knows what it is, right? Now, Ahasuerus, he has one virtue. He has one attribute. What is his attribute? The king has power. And what does this book say about power? Power is drunk, blind, and stupid. Power has no internal ethic. Power has no internal direction. Power does whatever the eunuch next to him tells him to do. Power doesn't know what to do about anything. Power, don't assume that just because someone has power, they know what to do with it. In fact, quite the contrary. The more power they have, the less they know what to do with it. And it takes Memucan or somebody to tell him what to do. Power has no ethics. And that's the world you live in. This is the world you live in. Now, just for a moment, step back with me. The holiday is called Purim. You'll see in just a minute where that comes from. The word Purim means dice. You throw the dice. That's how Haman's going to figure out what day to do this on. You throw a dice. The throw of the dice, it's random. The book of Genesis tells us about a God who rules, who creates a universe. The book of Exodus pictures a God who enters history to make justice prevail. He comes into history on the side of the oppressed because it's right. The whole book of Exodus is the idea that might doesn't make right, and that right makes might. That's what the book of Exodus is about. That's what Pesach is about. That's what you're celebrating at a Pesach Seder. That God comes to redeem us from slavery because it's right. And yet, here you have a book which says it's a roll of the dice. It's a roll of the dice. God, remember, Albert Einstein once said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Heisenberg disagreed with him. So does the book of Esther. The book of Esther says it's all dice. Now, this could be the diaspora exile version of reality. And then the question is, if you're living in a universe, I'll be right with you. If you're living in a universe where God is on the side of justice, the book of Exodus tells you what's expected of you. What if you're living in a universe which is run by dice, which is random? How the hell do you do? What do you do in that universe? How do you comport yourself? How do you behave in that universe? That's what the story is going to ask us. That's what the story is going to ask us to look at. And for this, one more point. What I'm going to suggest, and this is my way of reading it, and I acknowledge that this is just one guy's interpretation. When you want to deliver bad news, do it with a smile on your face and some humor. Like, the more disturbing the lesson, the wackier the story. The book of Esther gives us the most disturbing lessons about the world and does it in the literary guise of satire, ribald fantasy, erotic crazy stuff. And you'll see that the chapters alternate between just goofy stuff and deeply disturbing realities. We just read a really goofy chapter. The king has a World's Fair. At the end of the World's Fair, he has a 7-day wine feast. At the end of the 7-day wine feast, his wife won't come down and display her royal charms, and she gets sent away. And this is like goofy, but now watch what happens next. Watch what happens next. Look how it goes from goofy to deadly serious, and then back to goofy again. It's going to mask the seriousness in the overlay of satire and ribald fantasy and goofiness and comedy, just complete comedy. Yeah.
Two things. Number one, when we're in this room, you really don't need the mic to hear. But if somebody's at home listening,
Yeah.
and you hold the mic a foot away, or
Yeah, hold the mic right up to your
you
mouth.
have to hold it right up to your mouth, because when we're watching it
Yeah,
from home,
yeah.
we can't hear any of the comments from
Yes,
people.
yeah, people all over the world are now cheering for you.
So you really have to hold it up close.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing is, isn't it possible that the reason this book is in the Bible
Yeah.
is it is a warning of the repeated disasters that are potentially going to strike the Jewish people and do in fact strike the people all over the world in century after century. And although they survive in this one, maybe it's there to remind us that no matter how good our conditions are, as a matter of fact, look at Western Europe today, and maybe some of what's happening here, and that this book is a warning of what we have to be conscious of and aware of throughout all time.
Right. You could read it that way. Yes. But then why put it in such a strange comedic setting? Why not just say that right? I mean, I think you have it, but that's what's so interesting about the book. All right, let's go back. Ready? Sometime afterwards, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti. Oh, how's that country western song go? You know, poor Ahasuerus sitting in his bed. You know, here's poor Ahasuerus in his cold, lonely bed, thinking of the charms of Queen Vashti. This is the stupidity of power, that it makes decisions without considering what happens next. He banishes her without imagining what life without her is like. But luckily, there's a whole bureaucracy there to rescue him from his mistakes. Right? Power has bureaucracy to rescue it and mask its mistakes. So right on the spot, the king's servants are there and said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of the realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress Shushan in the harem under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. I wonder if anyone aspires to that as they grow up. What are you going to be when you grow up? I want to be guardian of the women, right? Let them be provided with cosmetics. Absolutely, right? Cosmetics play a lot in this book for some reason. Right? And let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti. The proposal pleased the king, and he accepted it. He acted upon it. So what do? They draft every marriageable young woman in the kingdom and bring her to the harem. Now, what consequences could that possibly have? So now we're going to be introduced to two more characters, the two heroes of the story. Are you ready? In the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So he is Kish's great-grandson. And Kish who invented an egg pie. No, Kish. Sorry, it's Purim. What do you want? Kish had been, real men aren't called Kish. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem with the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah, and had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Why did it just tell me that? Because there's something peculiar about the name Mordechai. The name Mordechai sounds Hebrew, because we all know Mordechai's, right? But the name Mordechai is a derivation of Marduk. Marduk is the patron god of the Babylonians. Marduk was the godfather of King Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem and took our family into exile. How many generations do you have to live in a civilization before you name your children for the gods of the people who destroyed you? How many generations before we start naming children Adolf again? No, seriously, that's what it is. Marduk is the god of the Babylonians who destroyed Jerusalem. He's Adolf. Now, think of it. So that tells you just how assimilated he is. Just how Babylonian and Persian he is. And one more thing about him. He was foster father to Hadassah, whose name is Esther. So Hadassah, like many of us, has a Hebrew name. That's her internal name. And she was named for her mother's favorite organization. And has a sister named NCJW. And her outside name is Esther. Her inside name is Hadassah. Esther is adopted from Ishtar, who is the female consort of Marduk. And I'll tell you the Ishtar story in just a second. His uncle's daughter, she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful. Her parents died. He adopted her as a daughter. When the king's order was proclaimed, all the girls assembled. Esther, too, was taken into the king's palace. The girl pleased him and won his favor. He hastened to furnish her with cosmetics and 7 maids. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had told her not to reveal it. What do you mean Mordecai told him? Don't tell him you're Jewish. Right? We knew Bess Meyerson was Jewish when she ran for Miss America, right? And, how come Mordecai said, don't tell him you're Jewish? Well, first of all, the fact that she could get into the harem and they don't spot her as Jewish tells you what? That she's as assimilated as he is. That her behavior, her ways, her language, her accent, she is Persian on the outside, and nobody can tell her any different from anybody else. But Mordecai said, don't tell him you're Jewish. Why did Mordecai tell her not to tell her he was Jewish? Why not? Come on. He doesn't want her to lose a chance. He wants her in there. And what's he afraid of? So you might be assimilated 5 generations in Persia, but you're still a little afraid that what? Who knows what happens? I told you my story. We took the kids camping one year to Sequoia. We stopped in there's a town called Visalia near the entrance of Sequoia National Park. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. We stopped for ice and milk. And the kids are running. It's an empty Safeway supermarket, just us. And I hear 5 rows over, "Hey, Dad, look, gefilte fish!" And I don't know why, my instinctual Mordecai response was, "Shh." I don't know what, they like gefilte fish in Visalia, but I don't know if they like Jews, And I've been living here my whole life. Like, there's this instinctual, don't be too visible. Don't be too visible. Don't tell them till you need to, right? It's just an interesting cultural note about diaspora Jews, right? Tuck the Jewish star into your shirt, right? Okay? All right, so every day Mordecai would walk around to know how she was faring, right? When each girl's turn came to Achashverosh, at the end of 12 months treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfume. So she's marinated in Chanel No. 5 for a year. I don't know what smell has to do with this, but they just marinate this girl, right? And they bring them one at a time, and then they all go to the other harem. So these girls are never going back into the population. These girls will remain the prisoner of the king forever. No, that's the reality of the harem. Esther was taken to Achashverosh in the 10th month. So 3-4 years go by, and he's having a different girl every night. This is some male fantasy, And then Esther comes in. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won his grace and favor. He set the royal diadem on her head and made her queen.
Rabbi, may I say something?
Yes, please, David.
Actually, all of these things were happening until about 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Precisely the very same way that it's written.
Okay.
There were a harem, there were a guardian of the ladies. There would bring all the girls that the king would want, and it would take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years for a lady to be with the king.
There you go.
All of these are very, 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 and all the Jews, up to 50, 60 years ago, they would go to a school that it was a Muslim primary school.
Right.
Half of the Jews wouldn't reveal their identity.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
they were Jews. These are all very, very large.
Yeah, no, I appreciate Thank you, David. I appreciate that. But because I think this reflects not just Persia, not the harem thing is Persia, but the attitude of a diaspora Jew of being assimilated but not quite comfortable, just slightly uncomfortable. Now, there's one little note that's added here. It'll come back later in the story. Mordecai is sitting at the palace gate watching out for Esther. Bigdan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and plotted to do away with Achashverosh. Mordecai learned of it, told it to Esther. Esther reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated, found to be so. The two were impaled on stakes, and the thing was recorded. Apparently, Achashverosh had some internal resistance. There was opposition. There's some danger to being the king. And we can spend some time on, were these two guys really the initiator? Would the two palace eunuchs be the guys who initiated the plot, or is somebody else the initiator of the plot? Because eunuchs typically don't act with initiative. They're just there to give advice. So it's interesting. We can come back to that. Now we get the fourth character. So we've had the king, Mordecai, Esther, and now we have the drama. Ready? I need your help here. Sometime afterwards, King Achashverosh promoted Haman. Sungam Habadata, the Agagite. He advanced him, seated higher than his fellow officials. All the king's horses and all the king's men bowed down to him, for such was the king's order. But Mordecai would not bow low. And when the king's courtiers to the palace gate, they said, "Why did you disobey the king's order? Why don't you bow to Haman?" And they spoke to him every day to see whether he would change his mind. And they explained, and he had explained that he was a Jew. Now, it doesn't tell us what that has to do with anything. If you're Jewish, you can bow. And if you go see the Queen of England, you can bow. You're not acknowledging her as God, but you're showing respect. But there's something, Mordecai won't bow. And you can try to figure out now why. What? He had back problems, right. Okay. This holy sciatica. Right. Was it a personal animus between the two of them? After all, Mordecai was also a man of the palace gate. Mordecai is a serious, important citizen of the realm. He and Haman. So one of these days I want to write, what Wicked did to the Wizard of Oz? I want to write a Wicked version of the Purim story. Right? I want to make Haman into a good guy and Mordecai into a bad guy, just like Wicked does. You know how Wicked does that? Makes the witch into the good guy, and anyway. But they have a backstory, these guys. I mean, there's a reason why these guys don't like each other. And he won't bow. And Haman needs it. And the psychology of Haman now, I want you to, what kind of man needs everyone to bow to him? That's what kind of man demands that kind of obsequiousness, that kind of worship, what kind of man needs, and doesn't demand it, but needs it. What kind of man? And you'll see in a moment, everyone bows to him except one guy. And he rules 127 countries, but one Jew boy won't bow to him, and that's all that he can think about. That's all that he goes to sleep and wakes up thinking about. Yes, please. Here now, microphone.
You didn't say anything about Mordechai as a father sending his daughter to live with the king. What a nice Jewish father would do it.
Do you find that disturbing?
Yes.
You find it disturbing that a nice Jewish father sends
Mordechai HaTzadik.
his beautiful,
He's a pious.
his pious, the Mordechai HaTzadik sends his beautiful, shapely young foster daughter to go serve the king in the palace and sleep with the king, and a Jewish girl sleeping with a non-Jewish king in the Bible? I mean, it's one thing if it happens at UCLA, but this is the Bible. I mean, my God, this is the Bible. And you find that a little disturbing, yeah? Yeah, do you? You find that a little hard to believe, you know? A little, yeah, you don't? You don't find, if it's okay.
No, it still happens.
Yeah, well, yes.
Marry a doctor.
Look, first of all, if we wanted to adopt the whole Me Too ethic, the whole story is completely ridiculous, right? I mean, horrible. I mean, it's just horrible. But you're right. Let's see what happens. That's where my friend in the faculty said to me, no, this has to be nevuah. See, God told Mordechai to do this because God knew that this is where my friend finds God in the story. Did Mordechai do this on purpose? Did Mordechai send his daughter into the palace on purpose because he saw politically what this could mean? Or was it simply the law, and you had to give up your daughter, and he didn't want to hide her the way Moses' mother hid him? You know, I mean, you think about what's going on here. It's really interesting. Okay, ready? So, Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel or bow low. Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone, having been told who his people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews. Mordechai's people. Why does he want to kill all the Jews if he's only mad at one guy? Come on, why do you want to kill all the Jews? He's what?
Mordechai represents the Jewish people and feels the rest of them will follow him.
Oh, so he's afraid that this is a whole conspiracy against him, and Mordechai is only the leader of the conspiracy? Okay, why else? Come on. Come on, you have to refer to the great Jewish Torah, the Godfather, right? When you go to war with the other family, you don't go to war with the guy that tried the assassination attempt. You go to war with the whole family. You want to, if Haman thinks of himself as God, right? He thinks of himself, he wants everyone to bow to him, right? He's not going to just wipe you out. He's going to wipe out your whole people to show you he has that kind of power. But now how's he going to do that? The Jews are an indigenous minority in the Persian Empire who have been there now 5 generations. They're rooted in the Persian Empire. I mean, Mordechai is a man of the gate. He's one of the leaders of the community. How do you get a majority to turn against a minority that's been there a long time? This is going to be an issue that we're going to talk about with Pesach in a couple of weeks. Because Pharaoh has the same problem. So does Joseph Goebbels, right? In the first month, in the month of Nisan, the 12th year of Achashverosh, Purim, which means the lot, were cast before Haman. The way you make important decisions, Nancy Reagan knew this as well. You get your astrologer to come. You have a set of dice numbered 1 to 12. You roll the dice, that tells you the month. Then you have another set of dice, numbers 1 to 30, and that tells you the day that you're going to do this. So it's actually New Year's Day, the 1st of Nisan. He rolls the dice, and it tells him that on the 13th day, the 13th day of Adar, this is when it was going to, which is the last month of the year, right? Which is Monday, actually. This is when it's going to be done. And then Haman goes to Achashverosh. Now, I bolded this. It's not bolded in the Megillah. But this is the beginning. This is the first articulation of anti-Semitism in the world. It's the first articulation of Jew hatred. Pharaoh didn't hate us. He was afraid of us. Haman hates us. And here's the first articulation of self-conscious Jew hatred. He says to him as follows: "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the other peoples in the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I'll pay for it." Now remember, when Vashti disobeyed in front of the whole kingdom, before we could do anything to Vashti, what did we have to do? Consult all the lawyers. Now you're being asked to perform genocide against a people that's lived with you for 5 generations, and right away, without a moment's hesitation, the king removed his signet ring, that's his signature, and gave it to Haman and said, the people and the money are yours to do as you see fit. Power is drunk and blind and stupid and has no notion of what it does. Now let's go back to Haman. Look at that speech. Why does he hate Jews? There is a certain people, start with that. There is a certain people. Remember, we were living in Canaan. We were living in Palestine, Israel. The Babylonians come in 586 and they destroy the temple. And in those days, the way that you pacified a land was you took its leading citizens away to the imperial capital. When the Assyrians, which is the northern Mesopotamians, attacked the northern kingdom of Israel, they took its leading citizens away to Israel, settled a garrison in the town of Samaria, and the people of the north of Samaria assimilated into the Assyrian Empire, and they were lost to history forever. That's the 10 lost tribes. They did not end up in Utah. Right? They assimilated into, because when you remove a people from its native land, when you remove them from their language, from their culture, from their community, from their customs, from their institutions, and you bring them to a foreign land, what's supposed to happen? They're supposed to assimilate and disappear. That's what the Babylonians were hoping would happen. This is 5 generations after the destruction, and there is a certain people, and you Jews won't disappear. What the hell is wrong with you people? There is something uncanny, unnatural, strange, somehow demonic about you Jews. Separated from your land, separated from your language. And here's what's demonic about you. You maintain a distinct identity, but you hide it. There's a certain people scattered and dispersed. You look like us. You dress like us. You talk like us. You do business with us. You send your children to school with our children. We play on the same ball teams. We sit next to each other in theaters and in civic events, and yet you're not like us. That's really strange. That's threatening. You see, if you were completely different, if you really did have horns and we knew who you were, that would be easier to deal with. If you wore a yellow star and we knew who you were, that would be easy to deal with. But the fact that I don't know if the guy sitting next to me on the bus is a Jew, I don't know what's in his heart. He could be one of them. I mean, how many, again, my dad and I used to love to watch Saturday afternoon monster movies, you know, and one of the themes of monster movies is the aliens come and they look just like us. And you don't know that the guy sitting next to you is a Martian, right? I mean, that's the point. They look like us, they dress like us, they act like us, and yet they're not us. They're different and threatening, because deep down, they're not loyal. They're not loyal to us. They're not like us. And by the way, they're said to have magic powers. They can do things. You know, they do things, weird things. I don't know if you've ever been to one of their houses. I had a friend over, I served him a lobster, he wouldn't eat it. My God. There is a combination of fear and reverence. I mean, the idea that they're powerful and they're powerless. There's a certain people scattered and dispersed whose laws are different, whose ways are different. And it's not in your interest to tolerate them. Tolerance is not an ethic, it's an interest. It's not in your interest to tolerate. There's no ethic of tolerance. We argue in America that there's an ethic of tolerance. I mean, America starts with a whole different premise. We're all different, and it's an ethic to figure out how to relate to you. Bring a plate of cookies to your neighbors. We welcome everyone. But here, it's not in your interest to tolerate them. Because ultimately, we fear them and we respect them at the same time. We fear them and we revere them at the same time. You Jews, This is classic anti-Semitism. This is the birth of it. This is what we suffered from for 2,000 years. Here it is, articulated. So, Achashverosh says, Geh gesundheit. However you say that in Persian. On the 13th, they dispatch messengers. The reason I edited the book is because over and over again, you get these long descriptions of Persian bureaucracy. There's messengers and dispatches and scribes. There's a whole bureaucracy that's described, and I took it out because enough is enough. But they dispatch this, and nobody understands why. And the last line of the chapter is, the king and Haman sat down to feast and drink, but the city of Shushan was dumbfounded. Now, here's the question. What do we do? The king has now decreed that we're to be massacred. What do we do? We have a year, by the way. It's Nisan. This isn't going to happen till Adar. Now, what do we do? Biblical theology. What is classical biblical theology? If something bad is happening to the community, what do we do? Why is something bad happening to the community? Because God is angry at us. Why is God angry at us? We're not pious enough, or better yet, we sinned. So how are you going to undo the divine anger? You're going to pray and repent. There's a whole masechet in the Gemara called Ta'anit, which means if there's a drought, this is what you do. If there's a drought, this is what you do. You know the song we sing on Yom Kippur, Avinu Malkeinu? You don't do it on Shabbos, because Avinu Malkeinu was originally not a Yom Kippur song. Avinu Malkeinu was a Ta'anit song when it wouldn't rain for a whole season, and you're a farmer and you're afraid to starve to death. You prayed, you fasted, and you prayed, and Avinu Malkeinu was one of the prayers that you said. Avinu Malkeinu, Chaneinu Vaneinu. So, let's pray and see if that helps. Mordechai learned all that happened. Mordechai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went through the city crying and loudly and bitterly. Wherever in the king's command, wherever in the provinces of the king's command reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Everyone lay in sackcloth and ashes. They're all praying. They're all doing tshuva. Does it help? Does it help? What do you mean it doesn't help? There's a God, right? God runs the universe, right? God's just, right? This is an unjust thing. We repented, we called God's attention to it. Did it help? That's the question. Answer? No. No. What do you mean no? That's the story. That's the whole story. I mean, if God heard the prayer and sent frogs from heaven onto Haman, and Haman woke up one morning and there were frogs in his bed and frogs on his head and frogs on his nose and frogs on his toes. There were frogs here, frogs there, jumping froggies everywhere. And Haman repented that he hated the Jews and became a Philo-Semite, and that's the end of the book. No, wrong story. That's the other story. That's the one we'll tell in a month when Pharaoh gets destroyed. That's the point of this story. I think, and I may be wrong, I think this is the anti-Pesach. There are no 10 plagues from heaven. There's no bush that burns and isn't burned up. There's no stick that turns into a snake. Mordechai tries the classic biblical method to fix this. It don't work. The sea doesn't split. So if the sea doesn't split, you need a different strategy. So here's what he does. Mordechai comes to the palace gate. But you can't enter the palace dressed in sackcloth and ashes. How come? Because it's the happiest place on earth. You're not allowed to come in there. You can't come in dressed like that. Put on something nice. Right? When Esther's maidens... Now, Esther is inside the palace. She doesn't know this has happened. She's been in the palace now 9 years. She likes it in the palace. She has a charge card from Bloomingdale's. She bathes in Chanel No. 5. I mean, she has dainties every morning for breakfast with champagne. This is a good gig. This is a damn good gig. She's in the palace. People in the palace don't know what happens outside the palace. There's no internet reception. So she doesn't know that there's been a decree of genocide against her people. And she can't communicate directly with the outside. She can only communicate inside and outside through the eunuchs who go back and forth, right? So here's the story. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. Now wait a minute. What did they inform her? And why was she agitated? Well, obviously, they told her that there's a decree of genocide against your people, and your uncle Mordecai is worried that your people, all your family, all the people who matter to you are going to be murdered. Right? Let's try that again. Right? No, that's not why she's agitated. Look at the next line. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear. Wait, she's angry. She's agitated because she's lived in the palace for 9 years and she likes this gig. And someone comes and says, there's a guy at the gate who says he's your uncle and he's wearing a burlap bag with schmutz all over his face and raving about something, and he says he's your family. So what does she say? What was there? Was there a story that when Meghan Markle was marrying Prince Harry, her father's this apparently sort of slightly out of control gentleman, and he was giving press conferences, and she kept going, he's not my father, you know, and he kept going, of course I remember, look, I got pictures when she was a baby. Like, shut up! I got this gig, man. Like, shut up. Now, anyone here ever been home with the flu and watched daytime television? I don't know how many of you ever had this experience. God forbid you should get the coronavirus, but if you do, watch a little daytime television. I was home for a while. Daytime television is a whole different world. There's a universe of daytime television. Do you know this? It's really strange. So one of the themes, one of the tropes of daytime television is whatever personal problems you're suffering, broken relationships, failed dreams, spoiled aspirations, disabilities and differences, it can all be fixed with a makeover! We cut your hair, we give you makeup, we give you new clothes, beautiful shoes, we present you, and it's all better. So what does Esther do if you live in the palace and that's the world you live in? Uncle Mordecai is outside raving about genocide? Send him some clothes. She sends him some, you'll die in style, right, exactly. She sends him some clothes to take off the damn sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hattach, one of the eunuchs, and said, go find out what Uncle Mordecai's raving about. And Mordecai tells her about the genocide, and he gave her the written text of the law, because she hadn't seen it. She hadn't seen it, you see. She didn't know it was, and Hattach came back, and Esther and tells Esther, and now Hattach is the go-between. So Hattach comes back to Mordecai and says, this is what Esther said. Now I want you to listen. What Mordecai says to Esther is what? What does Mordecai say to Esther? The king has signed a decree to destroy the Jews of Persia on the 13th of Adar. All of us, including women and children, everyone. Her answer back is, all the king's courtiers and all the people of the king know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there's one law, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends the golden scepter may he live. I have not been summoned to visit the king for 30 days. Does anybody see a dissymmetry between those two problems? He says to her, death and destruction are coming to us inevitably. And her answer is, it sounds like the little print at the bottom of the credit card application, right? Right? All persons known and unknown to the king who don't know the rules and regulations. What is she doing? Well, she's protecting herself, but more than that, what's happened to her? What does this tell you has happened to her? She has assimilated into what?
Palace life.
Into the palace. She's a palace person. And palace people speak palace speak. And palace speak is gobbledygook to the rest of us. She's talking about procedure and protocol. And he's talking about death and destruction. She's talking about, well, you know, there are ways of doing things and they have to be done properly and you can't. And he said, there's death coming. And she doesn't hear it. She has become a palace person. And she only speaks palace talk. She's drunk the Kool-Aid. Now, what do you need to do? You need to wake her up. How do you wake her up? How do you wake her? Or you want to put it in a different way? She had 2 names, remember? What was her internal name? Hadassah. That's her Jewish name. And her external name is Esther. By the way, the name Esther in Persian is from Ishtar. In Hebrew, lahastir means to hide. She's the hidden one, or the concealed one. Something's being hidden here. One of the ways to read this book, by the way, we could go it again if you have another hour, is to go back and find in every episode who knows what when. She's hidden. Now, there's one more reference to this. There is a myth of Ishtar. And the guys who wrote this book knew the myth of Ishtar. And they know that you know the myth of Ishtar, because everybody knows the myth of Ishtar. What's the myth of Ishtar? Ishtar was a goddess who had a consort, a boyfriend, named Tammuz. Tammuz is kidnapped by the gods of the underworld and taken to hide in the underworld in death. Ishtar determines she's going to go save her boyfriend, her consort, from the underworld. So she descends into the underworld. The underworld is 7 gates. At each gate is guarded by a demon. Each demon of the underworld demands, excuse me for this, that she remove one article of clothing until she reaches the 7th gate, when she removes the last of her clothing and enters into the underworld naked, exposed, vulnerable. And there the king of the underworld grabs her the way that he grabbed Tammuz. And he's about to extinguish her when Ea, the god of the whole pantheon, realizes that if you kill Ishtar, who's the goddess of fertility, there'll be no harvest. So Ea decrees that she should have her clothing back, and she gets her clothing back, and with her clothing she has her identity and her powers. She defeats the god of the underworld, saves Tammuz, returns to the land, and that's why winter ends and spring brings new growth. You know that story. And you know that Esther is a reflection of the same story. She has entered the underworld of the palace, and at each gate she had to remove one article of her identity, one symbol of who she really is, until she ends up in the heart of darkness where she doesn't know who she is.
But she's the goddess of the sunrise.
Yes, but we have to wake her up. We have to wake her up. So how do you wake her up? Are you ready? We got to wake her up. This is like Peter Pan. Can you believe that we can fly, right? Okay. So Mordecai said the following to Esther. Listen carefully. 3 arguments. Do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life being in the king's palace. Argument 2. On the contrary, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter. You and your father's house will perish. 3. Who knows, perhaps you've attained to royal position for just such a crisis. 3 arguments. Number 1, you can't pass forever, honey. One day they're going to discover who you are, and what happens to us will happen to you. Number 2, if you sit quietly and we all perish, nobody will ever know who you really are. No one in the world will ever call you by your inside name again. You will have no connection with anyone. You will only be the false front you've put on in order to get into the palace. 3, this is Beshert. This is the plan of history. It sounds like the Joseph story, right? This is why you're there. This is your moment. Which of those 3 arguments do you think convinced her? Door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? Let's make a Bible. Who says door number 1? You can't pass forever. Oh, no one was, only one person. Okay. Who says door number 2? You will never have a connection with your family again. Oh, okay. And who says door number 3? This is your mission in the world. You have purpose in the world. Oh, why? So someone justify that. Ron, why? Wait, Bill, wait, over here. Rabbi.
Hold on, wait for the mic.
You got to work in this shul. Come on.
All right. Because Esther begins to realize, I think, what your Hebrew teacher realized, who told you this. God may not be a character, but God appears to be the script.
Okay.
And she suddenly realizes that she's part of the story. And she realizes that at this point, everything that's happened to her has been controlled by a bigger force than herself.
Okay, so even if you live in the palace, dress in fabulous clothes, bathe in Chanel #5, you still want to feel that there's a narrative of my story that's bigger than myself. And when you find that narrative, when you see that there's something demanded of me that's bigger than myself, it changes the way that you see the world altogether. And you're willing to do things that you were not willing to do before. You're willing to take risks you weren't willing to take before. It's the source of courage. Courage is when you see that I'm part of a bigger script, a bigger narrative, and that's my role here. Okay, Farzan, you want to answer that? Pass it back. Thank you.
So this story is also about the duality of free will versus ordained,
Yeah.
and this makes it ordained.
Well, now let me ask you something. If a person says, I see where I fit in a bigger story, does that remove my free will, or does it give me a sense of my own mission and purpose because I still have to choose to act in the story as I'm expected to?
I think both exist at the same time.
Okay, that's fair.
So-
That's a perfectly wonderful explanation. All right, so I'll cut to the chase because we're running out of time. I got to go do a bar mitzvah this morning. She wakes up and she says, okay, I'll go. Fast for me. What she doesn't say, by the way, she doesn't say pray for me. She just says fast for me. Why doesn't she say pray for me? Where is God in all of this? It's really strange. It's like you would expect her to say, make a bracha, you know. She doesn't. She says, okay, have them fast on my behalf. Don't eat or drink. We'll observe the same fast, but there's no prayer. It's really strange. There's no tachnunim. Yeah, there's no prayer. Now, fifth chapter. This chapter is rated X. I'm going to read it twice. First, I'll read it rated G. Then I'll read it rated X. On the third day, Esther put on royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room, facing the entrance of the palace. As soon as he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended the golden scepter which he had in his hand. Esther approached, touched the tip of the scepter. What troubles you? She said, what's your request? Half the kingdom you'll get. So everything she was afraid of was nonsense. He welcomed her. If it please your majesty, let you and Haman come to a feast that I've prepared. The king said, sure. That's innocent enough, right? Now, the king is a middle-aged man. Late middle-aged man. Late middle-aged men, when they get up in the morning, sit upon the throne. All late middle-aged men sit upon the throne, some longer than others, with the golden scepter in their hands. I wish. No, sorry. And so if you're going to go to the king at the moment of his deepest vulnerability, when he's least likely to condemn you to death, and you're a shapely, beautiful young woman, that's when you would be likely to go to the king. So we're on the third day. Esther put on royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, whoo! She won his favor. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which he was holding in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What troubles you, Queen Esther? The king said, what is your request? Half the kingdom. If it please your majesty, let your majesty come to a feast that I've prepared. Sure, anything. Anyway, then Haman went out. Now, let's finish the story. It's going to be 2 feasts, but let's just cut to the chase. 3 characters are coming to this feast, each with a different motivation. Here's Haman's motivation. Haman went out happily and lighthearted. Why? Because he's just been invited to the feast with the king and the queen. And he thinks, I'm it. I am the third. I am the most powerful man in the universe. But when he saw Mordecai didn't stand up or stir on his account. It filled him with rage. He might be the third most powerful man in the whole kingdom, but if this guy won't bow to him, life isn't complete. So he goes home and he tells his family this, right? And he brags to everyone that Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king, no one else was there except me. But it means nothing to me, verse 14, that every time I see that Jew Mordecai in the palace gate. So his wife, she's part of the problem here. They say, well, put up a stake and impale him on it and have the king so order it. So why is Haman going to the feast? What is he expecting? Haman's going to the feast. First of all, that he is the third in the triumvirate that controls the kingdom, and he's going to the feast to get rid of that Jew boy. Once and for all, I will be the man they all bow to. I will order, the king will help me, the king will order him to be impaled. And the king, why is he going to the feast? Because the golden scepter told him to. Because he thinks with the golden scepter, not with his brain. That's why. Because he follows the golden scepter wherever it takes him. And that's why the king is going to the feast. Why is Esther going to the feast? To finally confront Haman and save her people, to reveal herself, to remove the last of that which conceals her real identity. She's going to become Hadassah again, and the brave Jewish princess. They're each coming to the feast for a completely different reason. Now, it's such an interesting sort of social moment when you sit at a table with people and you know that everybody at this table has a completely different interpretation of what this social circumstance is. Right? So what happens? I'm going to skip a little bit here. Let's get to the very end. Chapter 7, it's on the last page. So the king and Haman came to the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, what is your wish? Even half the kingdom. And Queen Esther, now you have this moment of suspense, right? You have to stop. Da-dum, da-dum, dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum. If your majesty will do me this favor, and if it please, now she has to be demure and ladylike, but she has to hammer this home. If your majesty, you have to give me an actress who can do this, who can be demure and then direct at the right moment, right? So I need an actress who can do this. Who can do this? Betty Davis? Is that what you said? Gwyneth Paltrow, you know. Katharine Hepburn. Demi Moore. Yeah. A woman who can be ladylike and gentle and then have strength in her all of a sudden, because that's what's being revealed here. It's a turn of the heart. Hedy Lamarr. Ooh. It's wonderful to have a group of multiple generations, because the young people in the room are like, Hedy who? You know, right? Katharine Hepburn who? You know. All right. If it please your majesty, will do me this favor. If it please your majesty, I mean, there's the demure, right? Because she says it twice. Let my life be granted me and my people as my request, for we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Suddenly, the king is stone cold sober. For the only time in the whole book, he says, Mi zehu, mi hu zeh, ve'ezehu. Mi hu zeh, who is it? Ve'ezehu. That's the phrase in Hebrew. And you can't say that if you're drunk. Trust me, I've tried. Mi hu zeh ve'ezehu. Who is it who would do such a thing and take from my bed the only woman I've ever loved since Vashti? The adversary, and the enemy, is this evil Haman. Now as soon as you get to that denouement, the book switches immediately back to ribald slapstick comedy, because the next scene is hysterical. Haman cringed in terror before the king and queen. So the man who thought he was so powerful becomes a worm on the floor. The king in his fury left the wine feast for the palace garden. Haman remained to plead with the king. The queen, so she's lying on a couch. He's in the room. He knows he's dead. So he starts begging her and crying in front of her. And he's crawling up the couch. You see this scene? He's crawling up the couch. So he gets right in her face, literally. But to get right in her face, he has to lay where? Right on top of her. So the king returns and he sees Haman lying on top of his wife. There are certain places you can lie. But there's certain places you're not allowed to be. That's one of them. The royal wife, you don't do that, even if you're Haman. So the king returns from the palace garden to the banquet room. Haman was lying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined. Does he mean, cried the king, to ravish the queen in my own palace? That's so funny. I mean, at that moment, Harbona, one of the eunuchs, says, oh, and by the way, he has a 50 cubit, that's 75 feet, 50 cubit stake put up at his house for Mordechai. And what does the king say? Hang him on it. The roll of the dice. The roll of the dice. Anyone play craps? Sure. You take a fortune, you put it on the table, you roll the dice, you lose it. You take one chip, you put it on the table, you roll the dice, you're a millionaire. It's a roll of the dice. There's no order here. It's a roll of the dice. It's a roll of the man who thought he was the most powerful man in the kingdom ends up as a nothing. The man who was destined to die, to be murdered, to be exterminated, becomes, well, what happens is he gets all of the property. The king decrees that Mordechai becomes, she's now, and what's interesting is that their being Jewish makes no difference to Achashverosh. In fact, he's a wise man. He has a reputation for saving the king, so he becomes prime minister. The problem at the end of the book is that you can't undo a decree of the king, so what they do is they arm the Jewish community, and the Jewish community then goes to war with those who execute the pogrom against them, and 75,000 Persian people are killed in the pogrom. And that's a happy ending to the story, I want you to know. And it ends, the city of Shushan rang with joyous cries. The Jews enjoyed light, gladness, happiness, and honor. La Yehudim hayata ora v'simcha sason vikar. In every province, the king's command, the decree, there was gladness and joy, and many of the people professed to be Jews for the fear, and many of the people of the land professed to be Jews. Do you hear that line? Suddenly everyone wants to be Jewish. Why? Because the king's queen, the queen and the second are both Jewish. For fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. If you can't defeat the Jews, make Shabbos. Mordechai, the Jew, ranked next to Achashverosh, was highly regarded by the Jews. Such a funny line. Highly regarded by the Jews. Most Jews liked him, except the folks who sat next to him in shul, right? And the multitude of his brethren, he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all of his kindred. The end. No, wait, but I have to go. But so what do we get? My friend read this book and said this is the most religious book in the Bible because God is on every page. I read it the opposite. I think it's a story about what happens when you live in a godless world. In a godless world, well, there is God in this story. Where is God in this story? It's in the awakening of Esther's moral conscience. It's when she realizes she is Hadassah, not just Esther, and gains the courage to step in front of the king. That's one way to see this. That's one way to see how this works. So the idea there is that if you would stop evil from taking power, you have to get into the bedroom of power. But the problem, the paradox is that the closer to power you get, the more likely it is that you become corrupt and stupid, just like power is. So the question is, how do you keep those who are close to power in touch with their inner identity, with their conscience, to understand why it is that we sent them to be close to power?
The consequence of this is the son of Esther and the king was Cyrus the Great, who was a pro-Jewish guy.
That could be. That's a lovely. The other thing I want to point out is just one little religious item here. If I told you a story that has a silly king, an evil advisor, a beautiful princess, and a brave hero, and you ask any 9-year-old, what's the name of that story? Aladdin. It's the silly king, it's Jafar, the guy with the bird on his shoulder, right? It's Jasmine, the princess, and it's Aladdin. It's Achashverosh, Haman, Mordechai, Esther and Mordechai. Same story, same literature, same literary genre, except that Aladdin has a fifth character. Who's the fifth character in Aladdin? The genie, which is Robin Williams, right? Robin Williams, Oliver Sholem, right? But the genie doesn't occur in this story. Now, if you were going to write a biblical story with the genie, it would be really easy. Who should play the genie? God. That's what you would have expected the story to say. And that's, I think, one of the purposes of the story, is to say, okay, maybe in Egypt, but not here. In the world you and I live in, God's not your genie. There is no lamp that you rub and say, open sesame, and God shows up and saves the day. That doesn't work that way. The way it works in this world is someone has to say, it's my responsibility, and someone has to say, I will approach power and do what I can. It's a very important lesson for Jewish history, but in many ways very contrary to the rest of the Torah.
So isn't this a Shlomo story?
That's the way I tell it. That's the way I tell it. But that's why I said at the very beginning, I'm really open to other interpretations, because I know that it's shaped by my own theology and my own life experiences. And I'm perfectly open to my friend who said, no, Rabbi, she wouldn't have become queen. He wouldn't have sent her into the palace. She wouldn't have been successful had God not been with her. And I'll say, you know what? Okay, I can live with that too. I can live with that too. That's a different interpretation of the story. Yeah, Ronnie.
Well, just one other point. There's part of this,
Yeah.
a part of the story you didn't mention, which for me always is the God part.
Yeah.
The king just happens to not be able to sleep because of his
Yeah.
suspicion.
Yeah.
And suddenly Mordecai's name as a helper comes up.
Yeah, well, we didn't do that part.
But that's
and who
more
is
than a
Bigdan and Teresh, and what role do they have in the? So this is a whole other part of the story.
Yeah.
And then there's other parts of the story which we didn't get to read about the dressing of this all. But it's a fascinating, really interesting, and really fun story. So we'll see you Monday night, everyone. Take care.